which is really what it should be. And you really should be back in your states and in your districts campaigning or listening to the constituents. But I think, we look at problems in reference to the budget process. We do need a 2-year budget cycle. And I agree with Senator Andrews that we need to drop the budget committee, that really the authorizing committee and the appropriation committee are sufficient. Senator Thurmond, I know, is the chairman of the military construction subcommittee on armed services. I'm chairman of the military construction committee on appropriation. We have held joint hearings, which is just logical to me. But what that does, it makes you get your work done faster. It also makes the right hand know what the left hand is doing. I guess in our case it'd be 2 right hands. But but I guess what I'm trying to say to y'all is that certainly there needs to be some changes, and I think it really revolves totally around the budget process itself. That going to a 2-year budget, trying to pass a constitutional amendment to balance the budget, I know I've said this 3 times now, trying to pass some form of a line item veto or some other new creative idea in order to expedite the budget process of the Congress. Because there's no way you can set target dates out there and expect the United States Congress to meet it, because it just won't do it with that many hoops to jump through. So the other thing that would probably help tremendously is if there was a tremendous reduction of staff members for the United States Senate and committees. Nobody's brought that up yet. But in fact, what that does do, I guess everybody likes to be stroked in this place. But the problem is, and it's not their fault, the staff members, but the staff members want to generate legislation so they can make their congressman or United States senator look good. So, I doubt if, 100 people in this body could come up with all the ideas that they come up with all year long. That says something about, somebody's out there trying to generate amendments, trying to generate bills in order to introduce, in order to make their senator look good. And I would doubt if that proliferation would come about if the senator just had to rely on probably a smaller staff. So that's probably got some merit also.
Senator Scott, before we go on to Senator Eagleton on committees, would you like to comment on the committee system? It's a subject that obviously is very popular, and it's something that does clog the machine, because it is impossible for a Senator Mattingly, no matter how good he might be, to be 13 different places on 13 different subcommittees. I know Senator Eagleton has been grandfathered in on a lot more committees, I think, than that. And it's really very difficult for these men and women to spread themselves so thinly and to even keep up on the issues. So, Senator Scott, would you have a comment on the committee system and how it could be improved?
Well, I think so. First of all, it's clear that the germaneness rule ought to be tightened. It ought to be tightened so strictly that literally only those matters which are truly relevant to the matter in hand can be considered as amendments. As it is, not only is the germaneness rule too loose, but too much power is given to an absent senator to make some provision which bypasses it until he can get to the floor, as Senator Eagleton has said. The routine quorum calls, that's the 3 bells, you see. It doesn't, when these 3 bells go off, it doesn't mean that one of the inmates has escaped. It means that it's a non-live quorum, a delaying quorum call. Delaying is what it does. If you're here in the Senate restaurant or anywhere else as a visitor, you'll wonder why the Senate is off duty much of the time, or so it seems most of the time. That's because they're having the delaying quorum call. They have another one with 2 bells or 2 stars, which means you better get the hell over here because we need business. But the 3 stars, delayed quorum calls, are a complete loss of the public's time. There ought to be some arrangement whereby during those periods when the Senate is not prepared to go ahead with a specific bill from the, say, Appropriations Committee, that during that period authority be given to the leadership of both parties to call up bills for you which have previously been cleared by way of unanimous consent, or to bring up information, or to use the time other than for just sitting around while the attendants in the gallery explain to the visitors why there's nobody on the floor. The trouble is, too, in enforcement of changes, and I agree that we have a tripartite or triangular system. I think we have one level of committees too high, whether it be the appropriations or the authorization or the budget, in that specific case, but we have too many. The Rules Committee of the Senate, among other things, does do a little more than the broom closet work, because every other committee has to justify its annual budget expenditure, proposed expenditure, to the Rules Committee. And generally speaking, it has to be admitted that senators who come there as chairman or ranking members before the Rules Committee and ask for more money, most of the time, not always, most of the time ask for more staff every time they appear annually. They ask for more expenditures, they want more committee rooms, while at the same time they are complaining about the waste of the taxpayers' money and the waste of the taxpayers' time, and that the government bureaucracy is too big, while they themselves are busy expanding that very government. As to generally accomplish something, to getting something accomplished, perhaps the old French maxim applies, tant pis, tant mieux. The worse it gets, the better it gets. Matters have gotten so bad in the past, for example, a few years ago, where Social Security structural changes could not be made if they became political. Both parties agreed on a truce, and each party agreed to hold off any criticism of the other, and the adjustments were made. The same thing happened to the federal increase in the gasoline tax. If either party had made a political issue of that, you'd never have gotten it. They had to get together and say, boys, let's don't fight. We'll agree not to blame each other, and they got through the thing in maybe 72 hours. So they can work when they really want to work. But the main problem, as I say, is the Senate doesn't keep its own promises to itself.
Thank you very much, Senator Scott. Senator Thurmond, do you have a comment?
I just want to mention one thing. It's been, we talked about money, and that is the thing that takes more time than anything else. I think we could abolish the Budget Committee. And if we don't do that, then we ought to combine the appropriations and authorizing committees, because they do essentially the same work. It's just duplication. A lot of time could be saved if we do one or the other. The other thing I want to mention is I'm convinced the staff should be reduced.
In just a few days, the 100th Congress will officially organize. This 200th birthday calls for not only a celebration, but maybe a facelift. Yet, in being critical of the Congress, we must remember that the U.S. and Great Britain are the only two countries to have the same form of government since the 1830s. The Habsburgs, the First Republic of France, the colonial empires, they're all gone. So what has made the Congress last for 2 centuries? For much of its life, it has been the predictability of the seniority system. The late Charles de Gaulle could have been talking about our own Senate when he asked, how do you govern a country with 256 different kinds of cheese? Unless the Senate's 100-member working parts can organize and give direction, the Senate body will have a hard time moving forward. What seems to be institutional paralysis is caused in part by the weakening of the structure that for over a century provided established channels of authority. The seniority system does make the congressional machinery work, and no one has yet put forth a workable alternative. Yes, there were abuses, and the reforms of the 1970s corrected, or at least sufficiently tempered, the most offensive of these. But the reforms should not be taken too far. A Senate without the seniority system, as Senator Proxmire points out, would foster all kinds of politicking and maneuvering to see who's going to be the chairman, concluding that the great thing about seniority is that it is the least worst of all the systems you might use. A further weakening of the seniority system would create an operational vacuum of uncertainty. The great Senate Minority Leader Hugh Scott summarized it best by saying, the lack of a seniority system would be filled by the most intense personal competition among its members, who would exploit weaknesses in their own colleagues in order to secure these chairmanships. So maybe, instead of a facelift for our bicentenarian, we simply need a reinvigorated seniority system. Okay? Great. Thank you.
Here all day tomorrow. There will be opportunities to continue this discussion. Certainly the bar will be open for what? Sir? Yeah. All right. You tried a couple of times now.
Yes, sir. I'm Steve Norris from the state of Louisiana, South Carolina. I'm not with the media, but it seems to me, just like the gentleman over here said, I was in Vietnam also during the Defense. It seems to me that we're here arguing.
Our side, which is what I ask they do, we would have a lot more trouble contending with it. If you got the Ayatollah being ushered in, or you've got some terrorist organization which is communist, proven communist, men who and women who testified before me were killed because they testified in my committee to say that they were communist, told me that they were going to be killed. One of them's name was Shlapani, black, one of the bravest men I've ever known. He goes back and gets killed. The media are still representing that organization as, and when I'm saying the media, I'm talking about the ones I mentioned. And I'm talking about the African National Congress. You could get angry with me when I tell you the African National Congress was originally a valid organization interested in the long-range well-being of the black people of South Africa. It is no longer that. It is controlled from Moscow. I had many black people testify who were high in that organization about its change. But that's not the way that organization is being changed. So it is not irrelevant to talk about the way the media behaves or acts or what they represent and the effect that terrorism can have in the United States.
Okay, let me make this whoops.
You can't keep using Vietnam as a crutch.
I wasn't talking about
That happened
Vietnam.
almost 20-something
This is
years
something's
ago.
happening right now I'm talking about.
If we keep using that as a crutch, we've come nowhere to combat terrorism.
The thing I talked about,
We can't keep using Vietnam as a crutch.
the thing I was talking about was
If
today.
that's what we're using as a crutch. We've learned nothing.
But the thing I was talking about just then in answer to you was today. The only reason I mentioned Vietnam is that when our syndrome began. That's when our syndrome began. Unless we get out of it, we're in trouble. That's just my view. A lot of people think that, though.
Let me just interject a comment here. At 9 o'clock tomorrow, this role of the media is going to be discussed again. If you'll look at your programs, we're going to have a very able and distinguished speaker. Mr. Ike Pappas is going to address this, and there will be time for questions after that. So using whatever authority I have sitting in the middle of this bunch here, the last 2 or 3 questions, let's leave the media for the moment and get on with non-media questions. Take 2 more, one first, second, give me 1 more. Anybody else? You've had one. 1, 2, okay, you got the 3rd one. Non-media, and then we head for the bar and continue the discussion there. Okay, yes, sir, first.
I'm Bill McKenzie from the Criminal Justice Academy, and could you take just a few minutes, members of the panel, to discuss our homegrown terrorists, our United Freedom Front people, Aryan Nations, Ku Klux Klan, and what you see their threat being today? The hate groups in America, not necessarily leftists, not necessarily right-wing, but our domestic, our homegrown boys.
Let's start right up here with Kevin.
Well, the terrorist task force in New York is really one of the lead units in regard to those domestic terrorists, some of the groups that you mentioned. For instance, United Freedom Front, the first one that you mentioned, Manning, Lavaseur and company, a rather interesting article that I just caught in the paper today. I was away and checked with my office, and sure enough that they found 700 pounds of explosives in a garage in New Haven, which, from all indications at this point, may be hooked to that particular group. The FAON, another Puerto Rican independence group, also a group that my task force is very much interested in. The May 19th, the Macheteros in Puerto Rico, the Black Liberation Army that was responsible for killing policemen. I would hope tomorrow, because it is rather lengthy in the urban terrorism section, which I will be moderating, I will go in detail about all of these groups. what hooks them up, what makes them very, very much the same in tactics and techniques and some of the things that they've done, some of the thoughts and concepts that we took away from the detailed logs that these people kept. And we went through that in a rather long trial in Eastern District Court in New York, where we got these people sentences ranging from 15 to 53 years. I think some of the things that the law enforcement has done with these groups, and I'll go into all of that detail, but much greater when tomorrow morning.
There's a list of about 4.5 pages, single-spaced, that I can give you of currently watched by the FBI terrorist groups in the United States. He named about 6 of them. It would just go on and on to go into them, but we have we have the May 19th, he didn't mention the United Freedom Front, many, many others. Generally speaking, the FBI reports in the hearings, we have to oversee them, that they are generally less closely together than they were, that we have been relatively effective by virtue of some legislation that we passed, like the movement, as someone said, from the Levy to the Smith guidelines. I had to take that through Congress. It's not unimportant, these things that I could have run through, but I do believe that our institutions, that the loving, lovable people of the media, the loving, lovable people of the government, and the rest of us loving, lovable people, ought to just be a little more loving of one another in approaching this problem. That's all. That's where and I believe that is where the real problem lies. Not that there's any enemy that is equal to us. We're the greatest people that ever came along. And all we have to do is stick together with our principles and prove it. Prove that we're interested in being one nation under God. Prove we believe that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator and so on. But we're not. We're coming to pieces. We're dropping our principles too much. And I think the media are not showing us a cultural society that matches the greatness of this people. And yet I believe that there are probably better people among the media than there are in Congress.
Second question, back here.
Walt Purcell, I'm a local county emergency preparedness director. I'm a little bit confused here. One of the things I hope the gentleman, I think they're trying to get at, what we're here for here, and myself primarily, is to learn about terrorism and what I've heard pictured here. Terrorism is the air of publicity, no remorse as far as victims and so forth. One of the things I'd be interested in is potential targets. Discounted nuclear facility. I don't understand that because that meets all the criteria for the next thing in sequence indicate that the bombing possibly is going into effect. We've had airplane hijacking, we've had boats, we've had embassies. What's next? If you say nuclear facilities, basically we can discount that. To be that big theater, that's real big theater. Second bit here on the Statue of Liberty. The average John Doe citizen, I think, would consider that to be possible. Discounted Olympics now on the train. What are some of the possible so-called targets here in the United States?
I'll read more slowly again. The National Security Council and the FBI's list. Large crowds, power grids. That means, whole communications and power links among the states, among the cities. Computer and telecommunications, microwave systems. I'm learning some of the weirdest things about what they can do to computers now to read what's on the computer through the walls with various kinds of detection devices. I can't even talk about it. I don't pretend to understand it, but it's wild. Government buildings, government officials, courtrooms, judges, nuclear power facilities, mass transit terminals and facilities, airports, foreign leased occupied buildings, military installations. It goes on and on. Foreign dignitaries, symbolic government figures. But those are all realistic targets, and I don't believe they've gone after them. All due credit to these gentlemen who are saying that they did a great job, and then one says, but maybe they didn't want to hit. I didn't mean to be sarcastic about that. I don't know whether they meant to hit it or not. I'm just saying I don't think they're doing their best to get at us in a terroristic way yet, and when they do, I hope we're ready.
Let me make a comment that we keep alluding to tomorrow, but it really does have a very definite place in the scheme of things, as to where tomorrow will be broken down into groups of your choosing. You will have 5 panels to choose from, and you may go among all of them. And this is where you can get to these very, very specific questions that you have every right to expect to be answered. The purpose of the panel tonight was to give you this broad overview of terrorism, what the nature of the threat is. And I feel like that that the panel we put together has probably done that very admirably, but you are all quite correct. You want specific answers, you want to get one-on-one, and we have a very excellent program tomorrow, so please don't go out and play golf and get on the beach. Be right here at 8:45 in this room. All right, I promise this gentleman. My question was answered. Your question was answered.
Can I make one comment?
Yes, sir.
I'd like to make one comment about the threat, like LA and nukes and all the other kinds of things. If you were out there, the folks in LA didn't believe there wasn't a threat, believe me. Good quality law enforcement, good threat assessments, a lot of sharing of information. Kevin knows that they're concerned about the Statue of Liberty, and they're doing everything they can to provide the best quality law enforcement they can. It isn't something you publicize. It's very hard to publicize what you're doing down in the trenches, but don't believe nothing's going on, and the guy out there doing his job doesn't believe there's a threat. That young police officer stopping a car believes there's a threat in New York City, believe me. And it's all kind of awareness, some good programs. Hopefully tomorrow we will talk about some of those kind of things. There's some things that can be done. We shouldn't be, there's a lot that can be done, as a matter of fact, if we understand the nature of the problem. And I think one of the things we overlook too often is good open source intelligence. If you haven't read them, get a hold of Senator Denton's committee reports and his hearings, and there's some outstanding information in there that's open source and you get your hands on. Good testimony, and we don't look enough at that open source kind of stuff. Look to the media. They have some excellent resources out there, and things like Nexus and Lexus and other kinds of things that will help you become aware of how the terrorist operates, his modus operandi, his tactics, his techniques, and those are the things that will help you deal with the threat. And don't give up. There's a lot going on out there. I can tell you, being in the middle of it right now, law enforcement is up to here with trying to plan for a major event. It's a major, monumental undertaking for law enforcement, as it is for every security officer who believes there's a viable threat in his area of operation.
One last announcement. As you leave, if you're interested in the shuttle bus going to the Ocean Creek Resort, there will be a Strom Thurmond Institute staff person out there to direct you, give you the times of departure. Gentlemen, I think that the panel has done an excellent job, and we owe them a round of applause. Congratulations. Thank you, sir.
Flow situation. We have to do that to maintain our leadership position against foreign competition. If we
Mr.
didn't,
Mercer,
I
I'd be
think,
happy to have you read the whole thing, because I think it proves up the case here.
I read the whole
Excuse me, Mr. Mercer.
Okay, can we go on? Incidentally, Julia Craig and Dr. Fleming have just passed out cards to the audience, so if you'd please write questions and continue to send them up, they'll collect them and they'll be passed up. And we appreciate the ones that have been sent up already. Now, Professor
Maurice,
Jensen, you have asked for time. Could you?
Well, briefly on...
And then we'll get to you, Commissioner.
Really 2 points. First, a small point. The supposed great difficulties that are going on out there in these organizations. LBOs have been going on, management buyouts have been going on for 20 years, these highly leveraged transactions. As far as I can tell, and I ask every single banker, portfolio manager that I come in contact, to tell me the number of such organizations they've been involved with that have ever gone into the bankruptcy courts. I haven't yet got to fill up all 5 fingers on my hands. Revco, the most recent example, and this is by far the biggest, And as far as I can tell, that was just involved a mistake in both in the way the deal was put together and in the way the investment bankers handled the difficulties. But even Revco has a very important lesson for us. See, in a world with 20% debt-to-value ratios, a management can launch a strategy that can be deadly to the company. And if its board of directors doesn't perceive that and act to stop it, and perhaps that involves removing the management in time, they won't get a signal from the financial markets, from the debt holders, until they've thrown away, wasted, destroyed 80% of the value of the company. Now, in the Revco example, that management launched a strategy to turn those drugstores into department stores. It was a disastrous strategy. All right? Because of the very high debt, they defaulted on the bond covenants within a year. Now, the stores aren't gone. They're still there. What's gone is the top-level management, and what's gone is that strategy. All right? That organization has been, that organization, although it is in bankruptcy, the debt is playing a very important control function. In fact, it's got rid of a bad strategy, and they're back on the road, and they'll do just fine. Now, I think it's very important to step back a little bit and understand that what's going on with the MBO-LBO phenomenon is a fundamental change in the way we organize business practice in this country. And it's going to look much more, it is beginning to look much more like what our competitors in Japan and Germany look like. What do I mean by that? First, for a large fraction, not all, but for a large fraction of the American business scene, what we are finding is that the modern corporation, widely held, diffuse shareholder, basically run by a management that doesn't own much of its shares and controlled by a top-level board of directors that represents public shareholders, is simply failed. It's as dead as a dodo bird. It started, there's a long, complicated story to explain why that happened, but when it started in the 1930s with the Securities Acts and a bunch of other regulations that essentially made it very costly for individuals to hold large equity and debt positions and simultaneously to hold positions as insiders, officers or directors. That has brought about the decline and fall of the American corporation along with the conglomeration. What we're seeing now is fundamental forces in operation to undo that, not in the entire sector of the corporate economy, but in a very large fraction of it. What's happening is by the 1960s and the 1970s, when that organizational structure had succeeded in destroying something like 30 to 50% of the value of a large fraction of corporate America's organizations, it paid for people to figure out ways to get around these legal constraints. The LBOs are one of those phenomena. And what they're doing, in addition to the debt, and the debt can be good, not bad, but in addition to that, what they're doing is concentrating equity ownership in the hands of the managers and the employees, and most importantly, in the hands of the directors. What I didn't tell you about these organizations is that the board of directors in these organizations owns or represents directly, through the buyout funds, 60% of the equity. The managers of these organizations and employees, on average, own 30% of the equity. The other 10% is in the hands of kickers and the debt holders. What's happening is we're bringing the ownership directly involved with the company. They're really partnerships. It's a different kind of organizational structure. They still call themselves private corporations, but they're not corporations in the way we say. And what we're finding is that it's not a paper transaction. These organizations are not being destroyed. If you look at Safeway, which was a controversial LBO, sure, a bunch of the stores got sold off. In fact, Clayton Dubilier bought, in a secondary leveraged buyout, the Oklahoma Safeway, and somebody else bought Louisiana, I think it is. Those organizations are still grocery stores, and they're doing just fine. And they have employees that have stock interests, even down to the checkout clerks, and enormous increases in productivity. This is revitalizing for low growth, especially in low growth industries, high cash generating industries, the competitiveness of America. It's solving the problem that is evidenced by organizations like Unocal, even Goodyear to some extent, which when flooded with cash, run by managers who basically own a tiny, tiny fraction of the equity, less than 0.2% on average, instead of the 30% that we're now talking about, and who are paid in ways in which their compensation is independent of the value they create or destroy. These men and women are in a situation in which, when flooded with cash, they refuse to pay it out to the shareholders. What they do, it's trapped equity. They use it, they keep it inside their organizations when it would be much more productive outside. It doesn't make any difference whether the cash is going out in the form of dividends or in interest. And any time Goodyear wants to cut the outflow from its interest payments, it can do that by simply restructuring. It can float equity and substitute it. Your friendly banker down on Wall Street will arrange that in no time at all. It's not a problem.
Okay, thank you, Professor Jensen. Mr. Mercer, could you respond quickly to that? One of the questions and the issues that are constantly coming up is the fact that is a publicly owned company, their manager, their president, is he less effective? Is he less given to the company than a privately owned one who owns a large share in the company? For instance, you've been 40 years with Goodyear. Are you less devoted to Goodyear, do you think, than if you owned a lion's share of it?
No, I've been more devoted to Goodyear through the years. The only reason why I don't own more shares is that I don't make the kind of money that the corporate raider does. If I could pull in about $32 million a year like T. Boone does, maybe I could own more of our shares. Or 500, and the junk bond salesman at $545 million. I think that's a great salary. I think the point that's important here is that you should judge a corporation by its ability to compete in the real marketplace, and that's the marketplace for goods and services. We make better tires than anyone, and we sell those tires